Hello, welcome to this little weekend vlog. As you saw in the last clip, or maybe the second to last clip, it's a beautiful, gorgeous, sunny Saturday morning out there. And I can't go hiking because our cheap German-wide train ticket starts only on Monday, May 1st. And I'm not going to pay 26 euros to go to the mountains today if I can go with a ticket that I've already bought on Monday. Of course, it's supposed to rain on Monday, but I don't know, I might still go anyway. Anyhow, long story short, all that is just to say that I'm turning this gorgeous spring weekend into a big reading weekend, inspired in fact by Dewey's 24-hour readathon. I don't do 24-hour readathons, so I'm turning this into a 2-day event, which it would be anyway even if I were sticking to the rules because of differences in time zones. So really, I'm just starting a little bit earlier and going on for a little bit longer. So I made a TBR for the weekend. As you saw earlier in an earlier clip, I bought a handful of tiny small booklets the other day in order to boost morale, to make it feel like I'm making progress very quickly and finishing books all the time. So of the ones that I bought, I thought for this weekend I'd definitely read The Reckoning by Edith Wharton, which is a bind-up of 2 short stories, The Reckoning and Mrs. Manstey's View, and also Ivan Turgenev's Kasyan from the Beautiful Lands, which is also a bind-up with the story District Doctor. I might also get to this bind-up of 2 Chekhov stories, but we'll see about that. I also have a poetry collection that I'm going to dip in and out of that I've been reading since the beginning of April, Les Fleurs du Mal by Baudelaire. And I've also downloaded a short romance novelette by Josh Lanyon, whose romances and crime stories, romantic suspense novels, novellas, and novelettes I've been reading since the end of last year, continually, one about every week or every other week. One that I've downloaded now is called In a Dark Wood, and it's of novelette length, so something for just before bedtime. And then, of course, I somehow need one main book for the weekend. The book that I thought was going to be my main book was How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. I bought it specifically for the purpose of making it my main book this weekend. But then I realized that it is told in a way that makes it kind of not a good book, I think, to read continuously and to binge read, because it's made up of kind of short stories, or at least each chapter has a different protagonist, one that we haven't met before. And in this way, it kind of paints a broad picture, a panorama of things in the year 2031 or from 2031 onwards, in a speculative future that Nagamatsu has invented for planet Earth. And I think that makes it a bad book to binge read, because I feel like surely each of these stories deserves that I take my time with it and don't always rush on to the next story. So I think I'm perhaps going to read one story today, one story tomorrow, and that'll be it with How High We Go in the Dark for the weekend. So that leaves me with a question of what book I am going to make my main book for the weekend, and I don't really know yet. I've been thinking maybe it's going to be Nothing Like the Sun by Anthony Burgess. You might remember, if you've been watching me for a few years, you might remember that a few years ago I read A Dead Man in Deptford by Anthony Burgess and absolutely loved it. Now, The Dead Man in Deptford is Anthony Burgess's Christopher Marlowe novel, and Nothing Like the Sun, as you may have guessed, is his Shakespeare novel. I'm hoping that it is just as brilliant as A Dead Man in Deptford. I've come close to picking it up a few times over the last few weeks, so maybe this weekend will finally be the time when I actually do. As for nonfiction, the latest book that caught my eye and that I bought together with How High We Go in the Dark, in fact, is The Lost Pianos of Siberia by Sophie Roberts, which is part travelogue, part cultural and social history of Siberia. But if I'm honest, I'm getting a bad conscience only talking about starting this one when I have, in fact, the Gulag Archipelago to finally finish first. I should really just get this done already. So that is what I'm planning to read this weekend. I'll get back to you once I have something to report. Hi guys, it's Sunday morning now, and I'm proud and relieved to report that I have indeed something to report. So I very quickly read through the two short stories in this bind-up by Ivan Turgenev, and I'm just as colossally underwhelmed by them as I was by First Love by Turgenev, which I read last autumn. I don't really have anything much to say about this, only that this will probably be my last encounter with Turgenev, hopefully. By contrast, the first story in this Edith Wharton bind-up, Mrs. Manstey's View, was absolutely devastating. It's the story of an elderly, lonely widow whose life has become very small, very limited. It's a really, really tragic story. I think the second story in this bind-up is going to be about loneliness in marriage, how marriage can make you lonely, but I'm not quite sure. I haven't read it after all. I read the first story over breakfast earlier. maybe I'll just read the second story over lunch. Very curious about it now. My first encounter with Edith Wharton, and it's looking very promising. I also read the first 2 chapters of How High We Go in the Dark. They both take place in the year 2031, the first in Siberia, where the permafrost is melting due to global warming and the ground is releasing all kinds of things. For some people, that's a good thing. For archaeologists, for instance, paleobotanists, etc. But of course, there's also the problem, the very real problem that the author didn't make up, of ancient pathogens melting and being released back into the ecosystem. In the case of our novel, one such pathogen is indeed released with dramatic consequences, and already in the second chapter we have corporations profiting from the fallout and from the consequences of this release. So far I have 2 complaints. One is how in this otherwise very realistic story the virus is behaving. It might be that the rest of the novel is going to be, the speculative element is going to be stronger and there are going to be more fantastical elements. In that case, it'll be all right. This rather fantastical virus will fit into the bigger picture. But at the moment, I'm a bit, well, not convinced by the whole thing. The second complaint, however, I don't think will just resolve itself. I have issues with the style and the language. I mean, listen to this title, will you? How High We Go in the Dark. And then there are the chapter headings. Chapter 1, 30,000 Years Beneath a Eulogy. Chapter 2 is City of Laughter. Chapter 4, Through the Garden of Memory. All these titles and chapter headings make a promise of a sort, don't they? I think they do. I think they promise that the novel will be written in a very lyrical, imaginative style. And it just isn't. The language is functional. It gets the information across. And in fact, I have a really big issue with the fact that even though the chapters have different narrators, their voices sound exactly the same, and they are first-person narrators even. That's just not exceptionally good writing. I think that if it doesn't change, which I don't think it will at this point, then I don't think that I will be as mind blown by this novel as so many people seem to be, or claim to be anyway. It's been a lazy morning, but I'm itching to go outside now. I think I'm going to go to the local cemetery and take a walk around there. Sounds morbid, but it's a really, really big cemetery with a huge park inside it, with a pond, with a bridge even, and there's a Celtic site, an actual ancient Celtic site, or they used to be. They planted trees all over it to indicate its extent, which is of course not the best choice from a conservation point of view, but at least it's kind of nice to actually see the site in the landscape. Anyhow, I'm going to take a book with me, of course. I still haven't decided on a big book for this weekend. Oh, I forgot to tell you, I also read In a Dark Wood last night, which was really amazingly creepy, more than I would have thought, which I don't know why that is. I mean, it's called In a Dark Wood, so I could have guessed that it was going to be creepy. But while I was reading all these short books and starting How High We Go in the Dark, I didn't really think about what my main book is going to be, so I still haven't got one. Don't know if it still makes sense at this point to choose a new one. We'll see how I feel when I get back from the cemetery. I think I'll just take Edith Wharton with me. Hey, so it is Monday morning right now, and plot twist, I actually finished How High We Go in the Dark after all. How did I do that? I skim read it and speed skim read it from the fourth chapter onwards, because it turned out to be really, really bad. My issues with the narration multiplied, in fact. The third chapter, all of a sudden, so the first two chapters were first person narration from two different points of view in first person past tense. The third chapter, all of a sudden, is first person present tense, which I have issues with anyway, but this switch makes it even worse. And then for the remaining chapters, the narration always switches back and forth between the two tenses. And why is it told in the present tense? Because the author couldn't very well use past tense for what he was going to tell, which makes I hate this kind of laziness when authors just cannot be bothered to make a concept for their novel, but instead make it up as they go. Or maybe they do have concepts, they just say, what do I care about consistency? So that's my issue with how the book is told, but I also have issues with what is being told, my issue being that it's awfully cliched and unimaginative. I only speed read each chapter to see what was the gist of it, and it was invariably boring, cliched, or even cringe. With one exception, I did read the last chapter scrupulously from beginning to end with clear focus, because that chapter was just the height of cringe. I'm not sure if I've ever read anything that was more cringe, and that says a lot. I'd honestly recommend that you read this book just to experience the cringe, to see how awful it gets in the end. Of course, you should get it from your library. Don't be daft and pay for it, as I was, and I did. Anyhow, that is all water under the bridge now, and I do have some positive things to report as well. First and foremost, that I loved the second story in this Edith Wharton bind-up as well, the title story, The Reckoning. So the first story was about widowhood, and the second story is about marriage, and it is about obligations, and how obligations, especially when they seem to be one-sided, can feel stifling and oppressive, but about how, on the other hand, renouncing all obligation doesn't necessarily set you free, it just sets you loose. Wow, that was quite pithy, wasn't it? I'm also really loving reading Les Fleurs du Mal by Baudelaire. His poetry is surprisingly accessible, which I'm not sure why I find it surprising, because after all, it is 19th century poetry, and while the things that Baudelaire is talking about in the poems might be unconventional and even scandalous at times, the ways in which he talks about them are very conventional and very traditional. I mean, the images and references that he uses, a lot of them stem from his classical education, so they are immediately familiar, and that makes the poetry easily accessible, even if your French is as rusty as mine and your vocabulary has grown as small as mine has. There is one more book that I read. I read the sequel to In a Dark Wood, the romantic suspense novelette by Josh Lanyon, last night. The sequel is a little bit longer, even though there is less plot in it. It is, to my surprise, not another mystery or suspense novella, but it's rather just about the two protagonists, the couple, or the one-time couple, working out their issues. This might sound boring, but I found it really affecting. I ugly cried my way through it, and it's entertaining too, because the protagonist's voice, he's a first-person narrator, and he is nicely self-deprecating. So these two novellas were the perfect bedtime read each, even though they are quite different plot-wise from one another. So that is 4 short books read and 1 normal-sized book skim read. Not a bad count for one weekend, I think. I thought about extending my little private readathon to today, which is a public holiday, but I really do have other things to do. I have a script to write for an evening event at the museum, and I have chores to do around the flat. So I'm calling it a weekend. I'm calling it a readathon. And I'm tuning out now. Until the next time, guys. Happy reading. Take care. Bye.